Today we are starting with economic growth and business cycle subject of semester 5. But before starting that subject straight away, just a brief information about semester 5, that what we are offering in semester 5 and what are the different subjects offered, what will be the way of providing the lectures. So some details about the semester 5. Now at the beginning I will say that no information about the current trading list for the session 2025 is available on the D school site. So assuming that there will be no change, and if there will be any change we will inform that. So assuming that the past syllabus will continue for the current session as well, because already about 2 weeks is now happened since the college has reopened, and no information further about the current reading this or any modification. So in the absence of that information, we will assume that the reading list will continue in the same manner, and if there will be any change we will be updating you also. So first thing is that in semester 5 the DSC papers are introductory developmental economics 1. This is basically part of, we can say, extension of the macroeconomics, one branch of the macroeconomics in the form of developmental economics. The meaning of the concept, the meaning of the term development, how it differs from the growth, then what are the different dimensions of the development, how we can measure inequality, how we can measure poverty. There are various index to be calculated, so some numerical aspect is also there and certain important dimensions of the development aspect. So basically it is economics from the developing economies point of view. So mainly we have to study from the developing point of view, the economics part. Second part is economic growth and business cycle. This is also a part of the macroeconomics, but it will highlight different growth models. So what determine the economic growth, what are the different models which explain the economic growth and the process of economic growth, what is the endogenous growth model, how it is different from the exogenous growth model. Mainly we will be dealing with the Solow model, Romer model, then Schumpeter creative destruction theory. So what causes the economic growth and what causes that growth to fluctuate, that will be the business cycle. So what determines the GDP and what causes GDP to fluctuate, that part will be studied in economic growth and business cycle. So we will be starting with this subject today. Third paper is extension of microeconomics, specifically the game theory and static interaction. It used to be a part of semester 4 micro, but now it is a separate subject, game theory and static interaction. So a little, we can say, difficult also and interesting as well. And apart from these discipline centric DSC paper, we will be providing the elective papers of public economics, then environmental economics, open economy, whatever subject you are choosing. So first start with the economic growth and business cycle part. Syllabus of economic growth and business cycle has 3 units. Unit number 1 is introduction to economic growth. Second unit is models of economic growth, which is the main unit because 50% weightage is for unit number 2. Third is the business cycles. Unit 1 and unit 3 will be combined, will have a combined weightage of 50%, and unit number 2 will have a weightage of 50%. So there are 3 units in economic growth and business cycle. So you can write some information on the first page, that first of all write down the syllabus part. So there are 3 units, unit number 1, 2 and 3. First unit is no need to write the complete detail, just write down the heading. Introduction of economic growth. Introduction of economic growth. So there is only one chapter to be covered here, and chapter number 1 here, and only 3.2 parts. But 3.2 part is mainly for the convergence idea. We will take that convergence in detail after covering the Solow model in chapter number 2 of unit number 2. So first unit is just give you the introduction about the economic growth, what determine economic growth, how that growth is different from economic development concept, how we can compare the growth of 2 different economies. So some basic information about the growth, and it will introduce you about the different models. So growth can be explained by different models. Each model will highlight different dimension of the growth, because growth के अंदर बहुत सारे factors involved है. Like growth, you can say that growth is a process of accumulating more capital. That is, growth is a outcome of investment. We can say that growth is also an outcome of accumulating more human capital. We can also say that growth is an outcome of having more and more or better technology. So growth actually depends upon various factors. Growth is an outcome of creative destruction as given by Schumpeter. So different economists has highlighted different aspect of economic growth. Those aspect has been presented in terms of equation and in terms of the model. So there are in fact many, but as for the syllabus, you are reading a Solow model, रोमर मॉडल एंड शुम्पेटर, ये तीन बेसिक है, और इसके लिए अलग अलग कंप्लीट चैप्टर्स, दे आर वेरी सब पार्ट्स ऑफ दोज टॉपिक. बट अपार्ट फ्रॉम दैट ऑलवेज रिमेंबर दैट model of economic growth also include Lewis model, Harris-Todaro model, that will come later on in semester 6, developmental economics. Balanced growth approach, unbalanced growth approach, critical minimum effort of Levinstein, then Knox theory है, big push theory है, middle circular theory of causation है. There are many in fact models, 15-17 in total, but as per the syllabus is concerned, you have to deal with mainly three. Again I repeat, it is Solow model, Romer model and Schumpeter creative destruction theory. So first part is only about the introduction of the term economic growth, what determine economic growth. So you have written that unit number 1, introduction to economic growth, and chapter 1 and 3.2 of chapter number 3 from Jones. Second unit is main, and this is models of economic growth. Weightage for this unit will be 50%. Weightage for this unit will be 50%. So most important content is going to be for unit number 2, because there are many aspects within that Solow model also. First we have to explain the model, what is the concept of the model, what is the concept of steady state, what is golden rule steady state, what is level effect, what is the growth effect. जितने भी terms use कर रहे हैं इन सबको elaborate करना है. Concept of conditional convergence, unconditional convergence, what is Solow residual, what is total factor productivity. So a lot of equation is also there included. Then we move from Solow model, which is an example of exogenous growth theory. I am emphasizing on that part, exogenous. So we will elaborate what is the meaning of the term exogenous, and how that exogenous growth theory and the problem of that exogenous growth theory has been overcome in the endogenous growth model, which is example of that is Romer model. So one important part will be here Solow model, another important part will be the Romer model. तो जितने भी पार्ट उसके बाद आप देख रहे हैं वो all are part of the Solow model. Then economics of ideas and the Romer model. So mainly it will be these, and then third part will be the Schumpeter creative destruction, growth through creative destruction. So that will be explained in the Schumpeter model. So I am just highlighted three parts: Solow, Romer and Schumpeter concept. Then simple endogenous. See the term when you use exogenous or endogenous. Exogenous actually means that if I say that growth is a function of saving rate, it is a function of population growth rate, it is a function of technological progress growth rate, without explaining what determines saving rate, without explaining what determines population growth rate, without explaining what determines the technical progress growth rate. So in that way it will be called as the exogenous growth theory. That means I am saying that growth depend upon saving rate, but I will assume that saving rate to be as a given value. Growth depend upon population growth rate, but I will assume population growth rate as a given number. Growth depend upon technical progress, again assuming technical progress as something given, without explaining what determines that technical progress. But if you explain that growth is a function of these variables and then go to explain further that the technical progress growth rate in turn depend upon how many person goes to research and development, what is the productivity of that research, whether research are duplicated or not, whether research, the outcome of that research depend upon the stock of ideas, how ideas are generated. So those points when you elaborate, then the model will be called as the endogenous growth model. So endogeneity means that we explain the growth process. The growth is determined by these numbers, and these numbers in turn are determined by the growth. Like population growth rate. Economy's growth rate is determined by the population, but population growth rate is also determined by the economic growth rate. Theory of demographic condition hai, which say that as economy will develop, population growth rate will change. That means growth will determine the population, but population is also determining the growth. So when we explain that process, then the model will be called as the endogenous growth model. So there are certain examples of endogenous growth model, mainly we will be covering in the form of Roman model. So second unit is going to be very important one, and for that second unit, chapter number 2 to chapter number 6, chapter number 2 and 3 will be basically dealing with the solo model part. Chapter number 4 and 5 will be related to the Roman model, and chapter number 6 will be that creative destruction. Again I repeat, चैप्टर नंबर 2 and 3 फॉर सोलो मॉडल और उसके जितने भी कोरिलेट्स हैं, जितने भी आइडियाज हैं वहाँ पे. चैप्टर नंबर 4 विल बी एक्सप्लेनिंग द इकोनॉमिक्स ऑफ आइडियाज, 5 will be explaining the Roman model, and 6 will be explaining the Schumpeter creative destruction theory. So an important unit, and most of the time will be consumed in unit number 2 itself. Then third unit is the side of the heading for this, business cycle. This will explain how economy fluctuates, that is GDP fluctuates. That means why not GDP for every year remains same, why GDP fluctuate over a period of time. That fluctuation has been explained by real business cycle. So term real means the real factors like technological change hai ya stock of capital hai, because they change, and as a result output will also fluctuate, but it is fluctuating around a long run average. So what causes that business cycle, what causes recession, what causes boom condition, why output is not always increasing at a steady rate. So that part will be explained by the real business cycle, productivity shock, but the technical shock, business cycle fluctuations and new Keynesian model hai. That means this third unit will explain the explanation of business cycle has been provided by the classical also, explanation of business cycle has been provided by the Keynesian also. But if you recall from the classical concept, then classical concept assume that output is always at full employment level. But if output is always at full employment level, that means it is not fluctuating. But when we explain the business cycle, it means output is fluctuating. So the neoclassical economists basically provided the logic that output can fluctuate, output can change, because the real factor which determines the output is also changing. And what are the meaning of real factors? Real factors like technology, employment. And what are the nominal factors? Nominal factors like money. So if there will be change in the money, then it will not affect the output in the classical model. So classical model ke accordingly output is determined by, and it is fluctuating due to change in the real factors, due to change in the productivity. But according to the new Keynesian model, तो न्यू केनेशियन मॉडल का आर्गुमेंट डिफरेंट हो जाएगा. न्यू केनेशियन मॉडल में आउटपुट, केनेशियन assume that output is not equal to the full employment, but we have to explain the fluctuation in that output according to the new Keynesian model. So new Keynesian model will be using the concept of Phillips curve, dynamic IS curve. So you are familiar with the concept of Phillips curve, we have done in semester 3 I guess. Phillips curve, Okun's law, उन concept को use करते हुए we have to explain the business cycle part. Now unit number 3 and unit number 1 combined, it will have a weightage of 50%, and unit number 2 only will have a weightage of 50%. Clear? And third unit is only that chapter number 16. So you can find in the first unit one chapter, in the third unit one chapter, but in the second unit it is the bulk. So chapter number 2 to chapter number 6. Clear? So we have written that part. Now you can write down the weightage and examination format. ठीक है, ये reading last year का ही we are using it. If there will be any update, we will inform you. 25 के अगर कोई update आता है तो, but in the absence of that, so first unit as you can see, it is introduction to economic growth, chapter 1 and 3.2. Second unit is models of economic growth, chapter 2 to 6. Third is business cycle, chapter number 16 from Carlin. ठीक है, ये 3 units हो गए. Then you said on the weightage and examination pattern. Weightage is unit number 1 and 3 will have a weightage of 50%, and unit number 2 50%. Clear? This is one information. Now what will be the end semester exam pattern? See, paper will be divided into 3 sections. Section A 30 marks, section B 30 and section C 30. Here you have to attempt 15 MCQ, 2 marks each, so 30 marks will be that. ठीक है, ये 15 MCQ होगा या 1 लाइनर आंसर होंगे, 2 marks each with no choice of any kind. So 15 में obviously वो weightage होना है. Half of the question will be from unit number 2. Second section you have to attempt 6 out of 8. Attempt 6 out of 8 questions. 6 out of 8. So you are attempting 6 question, basically 6 into 5. 5 marker question है, 30 marks ये होगा. See, there will be 8 question in total. So 8 question in total means 4 question will be from unit number 2 only, and you have to attempt 6. तो 4 question तो आप unit number 2 का ही कर लो. और unit number 1 से hardly I will say there will be 1 question, not more than that, because उसमें content ज़्यादा है नहीं. So more of question will be obviously from the unit number 3. So you can attempt 4 from unit number 2 only, and 2 question from unit number 3. Then section C you have to attempt any 3 out of 4. Attempt any 3 out of 4 questions, and now it will be 10 marks each. So that will be 30 marks here. Clear? 30 marks this, 30 marks here, and 30 marks here. 4 question है, so out you have to attempt 3 questions. So 4 में 2 question तो unit number 2 का हो जाएगा. Only 1 question you have to attempt from unit number 1 and 2. So if you cover unit number 2 properly, but a lot of content is there in unit 2. So if you cover unit number 2 properly, then majority part of your paper, I will say weightage about 50% है, but you are attempting in fact 2/3 of your paper from only unit number 2, because choices given है. हमें attempt तो 6 ही करना है, but weightage तो 8 question का होगा. तो out of 8 मैंने 4 question तो कर ही लिया unit number 2 से. तो 6 में 4 question तो unit number 2 का हो गया. So 2/3 weightage, 2/3 paper can be attempted only from unit number 2 only. Clear? So this is a information about the weightage and the end semester exam pattern. Now come to the basic concept of the term economic growth and development. So if you start with the introduction of economic growth, introduction of economic growth. See, whenever you use the term economic growth, it basically refers to the continuous increase in GDP or GDP per capita. I repeat, growth is a process of continuous increase in GDP or GDP per capita. That means GDP or GDP per capita are indicator of economic growth. Like we say the growth of Indian economy is 6.5. तो 6.5 अगर growth कह रहे हैं तो वो किस चीज़ का growth है? It is the growth of the GDP. So economic growth is basically indicated, it is a process of increase in the GDP or GDP per capita. So the indicators of economic growth are mainly two. One is a GDP, you can reprint it by capital Y. Other is a GDP per capita. So GDP divided by labor force or population. Population labor force interchange करके use करते हैं. And you can write it symbolically by small y also. So whenever you write small y, it is GDP per capita, and capital Y is GDP. So growth is indicated by growth of GDP and GDP per capita. But out of these two, the better indicator will be the GDP per capita. Out of these two, I am saying, out of these two, the better indicator will be GDP per capita, because if GDP doubles and population also doubles, then GDP per capita will remain same. There will be no improvement in the standard of living. Standard of living will improve only when GDP per capita will improve. So the growth model of whether Solo or Romer or Schumpeter, they will highlight what causes the GDP per capita growth rate. So, but first of all, we have to understand the meaning of this growth. Now, this term growth is actually different from economic development term. Growth is said to be a unidimensional concept. It has only one dimension. I am taking only GDP or GDP per capita, वहाँ भी GDP है. So growth is basically unidimensional in nature. It takes only one dimension in terms of the production. How much has been produced? How much has been produced total and how much has been produced in terms of per capita. So GDP and GDP per capita. But development is a multi-dimensional concept. It will take into account growth along with distribution of that growth. Growth along with, we can say, improvement in the health condition of the economy, improvement in the educational attainment. जैसे आप SDI कैलकुलेट करते हैं, तो HDI अगर कैलकुलेट करेंगे तो उसके अलग अलग डायमेंशन हो जाएंगे. पर कैपिटा इनकम इज वन डायमेंशन, educational attainment will be the second dimension, third dimension will be the life expectancy index. But over a period of time development के अलग अलग concept ऐड किए गए. Gender dimension has been added. Whether that improvement in the HDI is for aggregate or is there any gender disparity also. So there are different indicators of development, starting from the HDI, then the growth related development index, gender empowerment measures, inequality adjusted SDI, multi dimensional poverty index. वो सारे इंडेक्स आपको यहाँ नहीं करने, बट जैसा आई एम इंट्रोड्यूसिंग इन दिस फर्स्ट क्लास दैट growth is a unidimensional concept. So we are focusing here on the growth, we are not focusing on the development part. Development part will be focused in the introduction of the development economics. So there are many indicators of the development, but that means development will always bring a qualitative change in the life, whereas the growth is always bringing the quantitative change in the life. If you have more of income, you can buy more quantity, but in the absence of better health or education, the quality of life will not improve. So development always brings qualitative change in life, growth brings a quantitative change in life. So just keep that information in mind. And in this subject we are focusing not on the development, we are focusing on the growth part. And growth के लिए आपने दो basically indicator बना रखा, GDP और GDP per capita. Now when we explain the GDP also, you can because there are different models, so model will be always used or explained by using some equation. So output is said to be initially a function of capital and labor. GDP is a function of capital and labor. I can explain or express this function as A capital to the power alpha labor to the power 1 minus alpha. Y is a function of capital and labor, and I have taken a specific form of the production function, which is Cobb-Douglas production function. This Cobb-Douglas production function will be the basic production function in the entire growth model. We will start with the solo model by taking this production function. But as per this equation, if I write here GDP, Y is basically GDP, then GDP depends on, GDP depend upon A here stands for technology. GDP depend upon capital stock, and GDP depend upon labor force. It depend upon labor force. It depend upon labor force. So the model which will be with which will be starting with say that GDP is determined by interaction between technology, capital and labor force. मतलब इकोनॉमी में टेक्नोलॉजी, लेबर और कैपिटल इंटरेक्ट करते हैं, and their interaction determine the GDP. So obviously if their interaction determine the GDP, then growth in GDP is also determined by these factors. GDP is determined by technology, capital and labor force. So growth of GDP is determined by growth of technology, growth of capital and growth of labor force. Growth of labor force means population growth rate. Growth of capital means investment, and growth of A is technical progress growth rate. So economy's growth rate is basically determined by technical change, capital stock change and labor force change. So we will start with taking this production function Y as a function of capital and labor. Y as a function of capital and labor. सेम टर्म अगर आप इसे ग्रोथ रेट के टर्म में लिखते हैं, व्हेन वी एक्सप्लेन इन द फॉर्म ऑफ सोलो मॉडल, व्हेन वी राइट द ग्रोथ अकाउंटिंग, देन ग्रोथ अकाउंटिंग बेसिकली से दैट ग्रोथ ऑफ जीडीपी, दिस नंबर डिपेंड अपॉन द ग्रोथ ऑफ ए, ग्रोथ ऑफ के एंड ग्रोथ ऑफ एल. सो व्हेन यू टेक द ग्रोथ रेट इट विल बी के, मैथमेटिकली यू टेक लॉग, एंड व्हेन यू टेक लॉग ऑफ दिस प्रोडक्ट तो वहाँ से साइन प्लस हो जाना है. So this equation will be later on written as growth of GDP. I can write it as delta Y by Y. Change in the GDP divided by the last year GDP, that will be the growth of GDP. So GDP growth rate will be equal to growth of technology. Growth of technology will be written as delta A by A, then plus alpha delta K by K. That will determine the share of capital in that growth rate. This is share of technology in the growth rate. And for labor you write 1 minus alpha delta L by L. So this equation is the growth accounting equation. So we will start with the growth function, production function, then we have to convert it in terms of the growth. So GDP growth rate is actually an outcome of growth of technology, growth of capital and growth of labor. That is one thing. So first class can basically we have to just introduce about what will be the approach of this entire subject. Now if we have taken this GDP growth, GDP as Y is equal to A K to the power alpha L to the power 1 minus alpha, then what will be the equation for the GDP per capita? I said GDP per capita is GDP upon labor force. So if it is GDP upon labor force, then you can write this equation as Y is equal to A capital to the power alpha labor to the power 1 minus alpha. I am dividing both side by labor force, L से divide कर दिया. Y by L, this Y by L will be called as the GDP per capita, and you can write it by small y, and then this number will become A K upon L to the power alpha. So Y is equal to A K upon L, you can write by small k to the power alpha. This is basically equation in terms of GDP per capita. This is equation of GDP and this is equation of GDP per capita. वो जीडीपी पर कैपिटा के फॉर्मेट में इक्वेशन है. जैसे इन केस if I write y is equal to capital to the power 0.5 and labor to the power 0.5, तो ऑटोमेटिकली ए का वैल्यू हमने 1 ले लिया है. If I write in terms of GDP per capita, I will divide it by L. So this will become small y, and right side it will become k by L to the power 0.5, and that could be written as small k to the power 0.5, or you can simply write under root k. Y is equal to under root k. That means if k will be 100, then output will be 10. If k will be 200, then output will not double, diminishing return हो गया. So first is that we have to write down this equation, then we will explain this part. Then the solo model will explain basically what, that as there will be more growth, इससे भी अलग अलग स्टेप में बिल्डअप करेंगे. Initially I will take technology constant and labor force constant. So if I take these two constant, then growth of GDP will be determined by only growth of capital. So growth is an outcome of capital accumulation. Then one by one वो assumption relax करते जाना है. Then we will take labor force also variable, and finally we will take technology also variable. So what will be the impact of that? यहाँ तक का argument clear है पहले. ग्रोथ के दो इंडिकेटर हो गए, वन इज द जीडीपी, अदर इज द जीडीपी पर कैपिटा. देन अदर पॉइंट इज दैट व्हेन आई वाज सेइंग दैट व्हाट इज द एक्सोजेनस मीनिंग एंड एंडोजेनस मीनिंग. हियर द ग्रोथ डिपेंड अपॉन कैपिटल accumulation will depend upon saving rate. Growth depend upon labor force growth will depend upon population growth rate. Growth depend upon technical progress growth rate. We will assume it to be exogenous. Simply assume population growth at a constant rate, saving rate at a constant rate, population growing at a constant rate. That will be the case for exogenous. And when we explain the endogenous growth model, then we will explain what determines this technical progress growth rate. We will make an equation for that also. Clear? So this will be the process by which we have to basically explain. Then you can see this has been explained in chapter number 1 when you begin with introduction to economic growth, some basic facts, introductory chapter. Initial part you can ignore, no significant information is there. It simply talks about that overall role of capital, emphasize the importance of technical progress as the ultimate driving force in the sustained economic growth. Solo model is basically explaining what? The growth of the economy is determined by technical progress, it is determined by physical capital accumulation, determined by the population growth rate. So introduction में just वो information दिए जा रहे हैं. Then another important issue in this ये तो growth or development का information है. What are the different see the model of this first chapter also say that why different countries grow at different rate. Why not growth of all countries are uniform? Why they differ in terms of their growth? Why some countries are rich, why some countries are poor? The difference is mainly arising because they have different amount of the resources. All differ in terms of capital accumulation, they differ in terms of population growth, they differ in terms of technical progress, although they also differ in terms of institutions. They also differ in terms of the, we can say, the business environment. So different countries progress at different rate. So we have to understand what causes that difference in the growth rate. That is one part. So differences in the growth rate is basically arising due to difference in the saving rate, differences in the population growth rate, differences in the technical progress growth rate. Then over a period of time, why countries tend to converge. Convergence का idea in fact ये कहता है कि if we start with at some point of time, suppose if I plot it graphically, on axis I am taking a time period or different year, and to begin with on say suppose in 2025 a country is placed there, other country is placed there. ये in terms of their GDP per capita हो गया या GDP की वैल्यू हो गई. That means we find this gap in 2025 over a period of time, let us say after 50 year 2075, whether that gap will remain same or whether it will narrow down. सोलो मॉडल का आर्गुमेंट कह रहा है कि कंट्रीज विल टेंड टू कन्वर्ज. Why they will tend to converge? They will tend to converge because there are diminishing return to the capital. The economy where GDP is more is also the economy where stock of capital is more. With more of capital stock, the diminishing return to labor will be there. जहाँ पे stock capital का ज़्यादा होगा वहाँ पे margin productivity capital की कम होगी. जहाँ stock of capital कम होगा वहाँ margin productivity capital की ज़्यादा है. So if margin productivity of capital is more in those economies where stock of capital is less, then they will progress at a faster rate. So the country where stock of capital is less, GDP is less, they will progress at a faster rate as compared to the economy where stock of capital is more, GDP is more. They will also progress, but the growth rate in those economy will be less. So what we find, the gap in 2025 get narrowed in 2027. ठीक है. So that will be the main idea of the convergence. But convergence के भी अलग अलग interpretation है. Conditional convergence और unconditional convergence. So although it is written in first unit, but we will take up after completing the solo model. That is unit number 2 के बाद उसके cover करेंगे 3.2 का argument. Because although it is given that, so I will just introduce you the concept for the idea of convergence. So convergence mainly arises due to diminishing return, and diminishing return is at the core of solo model. So one part is basically explained in that. Then when you compare two different economies, suppose I am comparing one economy with the other economy, naturally you will compare the different economies based upon their GDP. But GDP of India will be explained in terms of rupees. GDP of US will be explained in terms of the dollar. So now how we can compare? We have to convert both into one currency. But if you convert both into one currency, then we need to use exchange rate. Exchange rate determination के अलग अलग principle है. Fixed exchange rate हो सकता है, flexible हो सकते हैं. So we will actually, the international practices we adopt the purchasing power parity approach. Purchasing power parity कितनी, मतलब purchasing power parity approach के accordingly we determine. जैसे for example you say that the size of the Indian economy is third largest, fourth largest. So you are comparing one economy with the other economy. So when we are comparing one to the other economy, naturally we have converted all economies into one common currency. So purchasing power parity की basis पे exchange rate का determination करते हैं, and then we convert all different countries, and then only you can make a comparison. But this purchasing power parity also has its own drawback. Like we consider a common basket of currency to be purchased in India, common basket of currency to be purchased in US. So suppose in India this basket can be purchased in 80 rupees, same basket can be purchased in US with $1. So we will say purchasing power of 80 rupees is equivalent to purchasing power of $1, therefore $1 equal to 80 rupees. But the basic assumption in that theory is trade between these two countries is completely free, no tariff, and now we have a very high tariff. So if there is no tariff, if there is no barrier, then only purchasing power parity concept will hold. In reality, the purchasing power parity does not hold here. So इंडियन इकोनॉमी के कंटेक्स्ट में और यूएस इकोनॉमी में, तो ये इंट्रोडक्टरी चैप्टर में सिर्फ वो इन्फॉर्मेशन दिए गए हैं कि व्हाट आर द डिफरेंट प्रॉब्लम्स दैट विल बी इनकाउंटरिंग व्हेन वी कंपेयर द ग्रोथ ऑफ वन इकोनॉमी विद द ग्रोथ ऑफ अदर इकोनॉमी. तो फर्स्ट चैप्टर इज ऑल अबाउट दिस बेसिक इंफॉर्मेशन अबाउट ग्रोथ एंड डेवलपमेंट. इस तरीके के जितने भी टेबल होंगे जस्ट इग्नोर दोस इंफॉर्मेशंस. So why we find enormous variation in per capita income across the economies. So different countries have different stock of capital and labor force and technical progress growth rate. Clear? So this chapter is all about introduction, just a short objective information given by Lucas that if a country is growing at the rate of G%, will double its per capita income every 70 by G years. That means if I consider the growth rate of the economy for India is 5%, so GDP per capita will double in 70 by 5, that means in 14 years. Whatever be the growth rate, you can calculate the how much time it will take to double the GDP per capita. अब ये सारे इन्फॉर्मेशन वो फर्स्ट क्वेश्चन के लिए आप यूज़ करोगे, जैसे ऑब्जेक्टिव क्वेश्चन भी पूछने आपसे, एमसीक्यू है तो वो जो 2 मार्क्स का हो सकता है, एक इन्फॉर्मेशन गिवन हो गया कि इकोनॉमीज ग्रोथ रेट इज 5% एंड हाउ मच टाइम इट विल टेक टू double the GDP per capita. This type of question has been asked. So we'll give you a list of questions to cover that MCQ also. But वो 15 MCQ होंगे वो पूरे syllabus का होगा. So hardly 1 or 2 expect from unit number 1. Clear? So, not much content in unit number 1. The basic points I have just introduced you about the meaning of the term growth and development, and the convergence, that is chapter number 3. Better it will be covered after chapter number 2. So chapter number 2 में model का idea हो जाएगा and they will cover convergence along with that. Clear? So 3.2 will cover after doing chapter number 2. So in this first orientation lecture I have just introduced you about the term of economic growth meaning and why some countries are poor and why some countries are rich. The next will basically start with the unit number 2, which is the bulk of your syllabus. Mainly from unit chapter number 2 itself will take some time. The solo model, then solo model के अंदर there are a lot of detail, steady state concept. Steady state के अंदर भी बहुत सारे points आ जाएंगे. We will explain steady state with only capital as a variable, then explain steady state with capital, labor both variable, explain steady state with capital, labor and technology all 3 variable, then golden rule steady state, what is the meaning of how that golden steady state is different from the ordinary steady state, what determine the level effect, what determine the growth effect, what is the idea of convergence, what is solo residual, what is total factor productivity. So a lot of detail in the chapter number 2 itself. So chapter number 2 and 3 will be devoted for solo model. So next will be starting with unit number 2. Clear? So we'll continue with chapter number 2, solo model. And at the end again I repeat, if there will be any change in the syllabus, I don't think there will be any change, but if it will be, then we'll be updating you. Clear? And accordingly we will change our the lecture as well. Thank you.